The Montana wilderness doesn't care about your tears. It doesn't care that you're a widow, that the men who took your home left you here to die with nothing but the clothes on your back and a broken heart that weighs more than any supplies ever could. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe sends you exactly what you need in the form you'd least expect. And for Eleanor Whitmore, salvation came on 4 legs, with scars that matched her own, and a stubborn refusal to let death win again. Before we dive into the story, if you believe in second chances and the mysterious ways life connects broken souls, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss tomorrow's incredible stories of redemption and hope. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let's continue with the story. Eleanor's knees hit the forest floor hard, pine needles cutting through her worn dress. The creditors' wagon had long disappeared, leaving only dust and the echo of their laughter. They'd called it mercy, leaving her alive instead of hanging her for her husband's debts. Some mercy this was, abandoned in the September wilderness, with winter approaching fast. Her fever had started 3 days ago, the same fever that took James. Now it burned through her veins as she crawled toward the sound of water. Every movement sent lightning through her joints, but stopping meant dying, and dying meant they won. The stream appeared through her blurred vision like a miracle, cold water shocking her burning skin as she collapsed beside it. That's when she heard it. Not the crack of a branch that signals a bear or wolf, but something softer, a breathing that wasn't her own. Through fever-hazed eyes, she saw the impossible. A horse, wild and scarred, approaching with the kind of caution that suggested intelligence beyond animal instinct. Its coat was the color of storm clouds, with white scars crossing its left flank in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The horse stopped 3 feet away, nostrils flaring as it assessed her. Eleanor waited for it to bolt. Wild horses didn't approach humans, especially dying ones who smelled of sickness and desperation. But this one lowered itself to the ground with a grunt, positioning its warm body against her shaking form. The heat radiating from its hide cut through her fever chills like sunshine through winter ice. She should have been afraid, should have questioned why a wild animal would show such unnatural kindness. But as darkness crept into the edges of her vision, all she could think about was James's journal entry from 6 months ago. Something about a trapped horse at Cutter's Ridge, barbed wire cutting deep, and how he'd spent 3 hours freeing it, talking to it the whole time in that gentle way he had. The horse shifted closer, and Eleanor's frozen fingers found warmth in its mane. As consciousness slipped away, she felt the animal's head turn toward her, standing guard against the approaching night and whatever predator smelled weakness on the wind. Morning came like a blessing Eleanor didn't deserve. Her eyes opened to find the horse still there, its massive head resting near hers on the pine needle bed, breath warming her face in small puffs of steam against the cold dawn air. The fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed enough to truly see her guardian for the first time. Those scars weren't random. They formed a pattern across the horse's flank that made her heart skip. 3 parallel lines with a 4th crossing through them, exactly like James had sketched in his journal. She remembered him coming home that April evening, clothes torn and muddy, talking excitedly about the stallion he'd freed from barbed wire at Cutter's Ridge. He'd stayed with it for hours, he said, making sure it could walk, teaching it some of his old cavalry whistles just to keep it calm. The horse lifted its head as she stirred, dark eyes studying her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. When she tried to sit up, weakness dropped her back down, but the horse responded immediately. It stood and walked to a cluster of plants near the stream, tearing them up with its teeth and bringing them back, dropping them beside her. Wild onions and kama's root, both edible, both exactly what her body needed. How did it know? Eleanor reached out with a trembling hand, and the horse allowed her touch, leaning into it slightly. Under her fingers, she felt the raised scar tissue tracing the exact pattern James had drawn. This was his horse, the one he'd saved, and now it was saving her. She tried James's old cavalry whistle, the one for easy now, though her dry lips barely managed it. The horse's ears shot forward, and it nickered softly, lowering its head to nudge her shoulder. It knew God in heaven, it actually knew the signals. James must have spent more time with this horse than just that one day. He must have been visiting it, training it, befriending it during those long rides he took for surveying. The horse walked back to the stream and did something extraordinary. It pawed at the bank until a small pool formed, separate from the main current, where the water could warm in the morning Sunday. Then it looked back at her, waiting. Eleanor crawled to the pool, finding the water less shocking than the running stream, perfect for washing the fever sweat from her skin and soaking her burning throat. As she drank and cleaned herself, she noticed the horse watching the forest line, ears swiveling at every sound. It stood between her and the dark trees, a living barrier against whatever might threaten her. When a branch cracked in the distance, the horse's muscles tensed, ready to fight or carry her to safety. "Samuel," she whispered, her husband's name coming unbidden to her lips. The horse turned at the word, and she saw recognition there, not of the name but of the tone. The same gentle way James must have spoken to it. "I'll call you Samuel." The horse returned to her side as she finished drinking, once again lying down beside her, sharing its warmth as the morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy above. Eleanor leaned against its solid presence, finally understanding. James hadn't just saved a horse that day at Cutter's Ridge. He'd created a guardian angel. The peace shattered 3 days later with Samuel's sudden alertness. His head shot up from grazing, nostrils flared wide, and he began circling Eleanor's small camp by the stream with increasing agitation. She'd seen horses nervous before, but this was different. This was targeted fear, intelligent recognition of a specific threat. Then she heard them. Voices carrying through the forest, rough and eager. "Track's fresh, boys. That stallion's worth $500 to the ranch bosses. Maybe more, if we can break him right." The voice belonged to Jake Cassidy, a name that made every homesteader in the territory lock their doors. Horse thief, claim jumper, and worse, though nothing ever stuck in court. Samuel stamped his hooves, then did something remarkable. He kicked dirt over the fire, scattered their camp with deliberate movements, and pushed Eleanor toward the rocky ground where tracks wouldn't show. She grabbed James's journal and the roots she'd gathered. Nothing else mattered. The horse lowered itself, and she understood. Climbing onto his back, despite having no saddle, no reins, nothing but her hands twisted in his mane. They moved through the forest like smoke, Samuel choosing paths that left no sign. He doubled back on their own trail, walked through streams, even rubbed against trees to leave false marks. Eleanor realized this horse had been hunted before, had learned how to disappear. When they reached a fallen log, he jumped it, then immediately turned 90 degrees, a maneuver that would confuse anyone following. Lost the trail at the stream. Someone shouted in the distance, "Split up. That horse is here somewhere, and where there's a horse that valuable, there's usually a fool trying to tame it." Samuel's ears flattened at Cassidy's voice. He moved faster now, but still carefully, silently. Eleanor remembered James's whistle for quiet advance and tried it softly. Samuel's response was immediate, his gait changing to an almost supernatural silence despite his size. They wove between trees, the horse somehow knowing which branches would snap and which would bend soundlessly. The sound of water grew louder, not a stream but something more powerful. Samuel headed straight for it, and Eleanor's heart nearly stopped when she saw their destination. A waterfall, massive and roaring, with what looked like solid rock behind it. But Samuel didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward the crushing water, then suddenly veered left where a narrow ledge, invisible from any other angle, led behind the falls. The cave behind was shallow but dry, centuries of wind having carved it from softer stone. Samuel positioned himself at the entrance, his dark coat blending with the shadows, while the falling water created a curtain of white noise that masked their breathing. Eleanor slid from his back, legs shaking, and pressed against the cave wall. Through the water curtain, she saw shapes moving. Cassidy's men, searching the riverbank. One stood directly in front of the waterfall, so close she could see the tobacco stains on his teeth when he spat. "Nobody could survive behind that water," he declared. "Check downstream. Maybe the horse threw whoever was riding it." They waited in the cave for hours, until darkness made searching impossible. Only then did Samuel relax, his head dropping slightly. Eleanor stroked his neck, feeling the trust that had grown between them. This horse hadn't just saved James once. It had learned from him, absorbed his military tactics, his way of thinking. Samuel led her away from the waterfall before dawn, taking paths no human would choose. By noon, they'd climbed into higher country, where the air thinned and the trees grew different, older. He moved with purpose now, no longer fleeing but heading somewhere specific. Eleanor trusted him completely, even when he led her through a passage between two boulders, so narrow she had to dismount and squeeze through. On the other side lay a small valley hidden from the world. A shelter stood there, built in the Blackfoot way with logs and earth, sturdy enough to last decades. Samuel walked straight to it and pushed open the door with his nose, familiar with this place in a way that made Eleanor's chest tighten with questions. Inside, supplies lined the walls. Dried meat, sealed containers of grain, medicine bottles with labels in James's handwriting, and something that stopped her heart. Children's toys, carefully carved horses and dolls, abandoned in haste. A family had lived here, fled quickly, but left everything arranged as if expecting someone. On the rough wooden table sat a letter wrapped in oilcloth. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened it, recognizing the Blackfoot symbols alongside broken English. "Friend of James, come, take all. We go north, soldiers make us leave. James say if trouble come, his people find this place. Horse no way. Trust horse." Samuel had entered the shelter behind her, his presence filling the small space. He walked to a corner where a blanket lay folded and pawed at it gently. Underneath, Eleanor found more treasures. James's spare rifle, ammunition, and his medicine kit from his cavalry days. The one he'd said was lost in a river crossing. "You knew them," she whispered to Samuel. "James brought you here. He helped this family, and you remembered." The medicine kit held laudanum, willow bark, and most importantly, quinine. The lung fever that had been building in her chest since the waterfall could be fought now. She took the bitter medicine gratefully, then explored further. The family had left enough supplies for months. Smoked venison, pemmican, dried berries, even salt and flour. They'd prepared this place as a refuge, a way station for anyone James might send. Samuel moved through the shelter like he owned it, showing her things. A hidden spring in the back corner, covered with boards to keep it clean. A smoke hole that could be closed with a clever flap system. A stable area attached to the main structure where he settled himself, though the door between remained open. As night fell, Eleanor built a small fire in the ingenious fireplace that dispersed smoke through multiple small vents, making it invisible from outside. She prepared a meal from the stored food, even finding tea leaves that brought tears to her eyes. Civilization in the wilderness, courtesy of people James had helped, people whose names she might never know. Reading James's journal by firelight, she found the truth. Multiple entries about the Running Bear family, how he'd warned them about soldiers coming to force them onto reservations, helped them hide their children when measles struck the government school. The last entry about them showed RB the hidden valley today. If trouble comes, they'll be safe there. The stallion knows the way now. Practiced the route 3 times. Samuel, the horse with scars, hadn't just stumbled upon her by chance. James had trained him for this, prepared him to be a guide. The scream that pierced the morning silence was young, terrified, and close. Samuel reacted before Eleanor, bursting from the shelter and racing toward the sound. Eleanor grabbed the medical kit and followed, finding him stopped at a cluster of rocks where blood painted the ground crimson. A Blackfoot girl, maybe 10 years old, lay trapped in a fur trader's steel trap, its teeth buried deep in her leg. Her face had gone gray with shock, eyes rolling back. The trap was chained to an iron stake driven deep into the ground. Fresh bruises on her arm suggested she'd been running from something, or someone, when she'd stumbled into this horror. Eleanor dropped beside her, her midwife, training, taking over. The girl's pulse was weak, rapid, major blood loss, possible arterial damage. "Samuel, guard," she commanded, using James's cavalry whistle. The horse immediately began circling them, watching the forest. The trap's mechanism was complex, designed to hold wolves. Eleanor tried prying it open but lacked the strength. Then Samuel did something extraordinary. He positioned his hoof precisely on the release mechanism and pressed down with controlled force while Eleanor pulled the jaws apart. The girl screamed as her leg came free, blood flowing faster now. "Pressure, need pressure," Eleanor muttered, tearing her petticoat into strips. The girl's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Samuel. "Spirit who remembers," she whispered in accented English. "You came back." Eleanor's hands stilled for a moment. This girl knew Samuel, knew him by another name, but there was no time for questions. The wound was deep, possibly to the bone. She poured James's precious alcohol over it, causing another scream, then packed it with the herbal poultice she'd seen in the medicine kit, the one marked for deep wounds in James's hand. The girl babbled in Blackfoot and English, delirious with pain. "Men killed Papa. Mama told me run. Find spirit who remembers. He knows safe place." Her small hand reached for Samuel, who lowered his great head, letting her fingers tangle in his mane. Eleanor worked through the day, cleaning, stitching with the kit's sutures, fighting infection with everything she had. The girl, White Dove, she finally learned, drifted in and out of consciousness. Her story came in pieces. Cassidy's men had come for their land papers, the documents that proved their family's claim to valuable water rights. They'd killed her parents when they wouldn't sign them over. She'd escaped with the papers sewn into her dress. Samuel never left the girl's side. When wolves appeared at dusk, drawn by the scent of blood, he became something terrifying. Ears flat, teeth bared, striking out with hooves that could shatter skulls. One wolf got too close and Samuel grabbed it by the neck, shaking it like a dog would a rat, flinging the body away. The pack retreated, understanding this horse was no prey animal. Through the night, Eleanor kept vigil. White Dove's fever spiked, and she talked to Samuel in Blackfoot, telling him stories about when he was young, when her family first found him orphaned, raised him until he grew wild, how James had reminded them of her grandfather, the way he spoke to horses. That's why they'd trusted him with their secret valley. By morning, the fever broke. White Dove opened clear eyes, looking first for Samuel, then at Eleanor. "You're James's woman," she said. It wasn't a question. Spirit who remembers only trusts two kinds of people, my family and James's family. Winter arrived like a predator, sudden and merciless. The first blizzard trapped them in the shelter for 6 days, snow piling higher than the windows. Eleanor had thought she knew cold, but this was something else entirely. Without Samuel, they would have died in the first week. The horse became their lifeline to survival. Each morning, he'd push through snow that reached his chest, disappearing into the white void. Eleanor would panic, thinking he'd finally abandoned them. But he always returned, sometimes with pine branches full of edible bark clutched in his teeth. Once, impossibly, with honeycomb from a tree hollow, the sleeping bees undisturbed by his gentle theft. White Dove, her leg healing but still weak, taught Eleanor the Blackfoot way of seeing. "Spirit who remembers isn't just a horse," she explained, mixing herbs for tea. "He carries the wisdom of every person who ever loved him. My grandfather, who taught him to find food. My mother, who showed him medicinal plants. James, who gave him soldiers' courage." Eleanor taught the girl in return. Letters and numbers, yes, but also her midwife's knowledge. How to read a fever, set a bone, birth a baby if needed. They created a school in that shelter, using charcoal on bark, while outside the world disappeared under white. Samuel's intelligence revealed itself in subtle ways. When Eleanor developed a deep cough that wouldn't break, he led her to a specific tree, pawing at its base until she understood. The inner bark, White Dove explained, was medicine her grandmother used for lung sickness. It worked within days. When White Dove's injured leg ached before storms, Samuel would lie beside her, his body heat better than any compress. The darkest moment came in February. Food was running low despite their rationing. Samuel had been gone for 2 days, the longest yet. White Dove lay fevered again, infection returning to her leg. Eleanor was preparing to amputate with James's surgical saw when she heard it. A thundering through the snow. Samuel burst into the shelter, not alone but leading a small herd of elk directly to their door. He'd somehow driven them through the deep snow, trapping them against the shelter. Eleanor didn't question the gift. She took James's rifle and did what was necessary. One elk meant meat for weeks, hide for warmth, bones for soup. The others Samuel let scatter, having taken only what was needed. That night, as they feast on fresh meat for the first time in months, Eleanor found Samuel standing over White Dove's sleeping form. He wasn't lying down, but standing, positioned so his body blocked the cold draft from a gap in the wall she hadn't even noticed. He'd been doing this every night, she realized. Standing guard, giving up his own rest to keep a child warm. "He remembers everything," White Dove said, startling Eleanor, who thought she was asleep. "Every kindness shown to him, every lesson learned. My grandfather said horses like him come once in 7 generations. They're not just horses. They're the memory of every person who ever loved them, walking on 4 legs. March brought the thaw, and with it, a new problem. The papers White Dove carried, water rights worth a fortune, would bring Cassidy back once the passes cleared. Eleanor made a decision. They wouldn't run anymore. They'd head to Fort Benton, to her sister Ruth, who'd married well. It was time to fight back with law instead of running. Spring rain pelted the shelter as White Dove spread the water rights papers on the table, her hands trembling. "Mama sewed them into my dress before she died. Said they were worth dying for, worth killing for." The documents bore official seals, signatures, and most importantly, a survey map showing water access that would make the land invaluable. Eleanor studied them by lamplight, while Samuel stood unusually still by the door, his ears tracking something distant. "These weren't just your family's papers," Eleanor breathed, recognizing names. "These prove water rights for 6 Blackfoot families. Cassidy wasn't just after your land. He wanted to control the entire valley's water supply." White Dove's eyes darkened. "Papa wouldn't sign them over to Cassidy. Said a man who poisons wells in summer to force people to sell wouldn't stop at paper. He'd kill everyone eventually." She paused, looking at Eleanor strangely. "Cassidy told Papa he'd done it before. Poisoned a stubborn homesteader who wouldn't forge documents. Said the man died thinking it was fever." The words hit Eleanor like ice water. James hadn't been sick before that week. He'd been strong, healthy, then suddenly burning with fever after meeting with Cassidy about purchasing some land rights. She'd thought it was the same illness going around, but no one else in their area had gotten sick. Just James. "The tea," she whispered, remembering. "Cassidy brought tea that day, said it was a peace offering." James drank it to be polite. Her hands shook as she opened James's journal to the last entries. There it was, in his increasingly unsteady handwriting. "Cassidy visited again. Stomach burning. Don't trust him. If something happens to me, Eleanor must leave. He wants the survey maps." "I burned them," Samuel suddenly snorted, pawing at the ground with violent strikes. His agitation was different from before, not fear but rage. White Dove watched him carefully. "He understands. Animals know death, bringers. My grandfather said spirit who remembers attacked a man once, unprovoked, we thought. Later, we learned that man had poisoned our dogs." Eleanor felt the truth settling in her bones like winter cold. James had been murdered. Slowly, deliberately poisoned by a man who'd sat at their table, smiled at her, expressed condolences at the funeral. The same man now hunting them through the wilderness. "We have more than water rights," Eleanor said slowly. "We have James's journal describing Cassidy's visits, his suspicions. Your testimony about what Cassidy said. My testimony about the tea. It's enough for a murder investigation if we can get to proper authorities." That night, Samuel disappeared. Eleanor and White Dove waited anxiously, fearing he'd abandoned them now that the truth was revealed. But at dawn, he returned, and he wasn't alone. 3 other horses followed him, wild mustangs with the same intelligent eyes. He'd brought reinforcements, as if understanding they'd need help for what came next. White Dove laughed for the first time in months. "He's building an army. My mother always said he'd protect those who protected him." She turned serious. "But Cassidy has real armies. 20 men, at least. and he owns the sheriff in the nearest town. Eleanor made a decision that would have seemed impossible months ago. Then we don't go to the nearest town. We go to Fort Benton, to my sister Ruth. Her husband is a federal judge. Cassidy can't buy federal law. Samuel stood between them and the door, and Eleanor understood his message. The journey would be dangerous. Cassidy would be watching the trails to Fort Benton. But looking at the horse who'd saved her, at the child who'd become her family, Eleanor knew they had no choice. They'd made it 3 days toward Fort Benton when Samuel began his strange behavior. He'd leave them for hours, returning with more wild horses each time. By the 4th day, 15 mustangs followed their small group, keeping pace at a distance. Eleanor couldn't understand it until White Dove explained. He's gathering witnesses. Horses remember violence. If Cassidy attacks, the herd will remember who the killers are. The attack came at dawn, on the 5th day. Eleanor woke to Samuel screaming, a sound she'd never heard from him. Cassidy's camp surrounded them, 20 men with rifles drawn. Jake Cassidy himself sat mounted, grinning like he'd already won. Missing horse, stolen child, and a widow who should have died months ago. This ends now. Samuel stood between them and Cassidy, head high, defiant. The wild herd had vanished, which seemed to amuse Cassidy. Even your horse's friends abandoned you. Smart animals. He aimed his pistol at Samuel. This one's worth good money, but I think I'll enjoy killing him more. That's when the thunder started. Not from the sky, but from the earth. The wild herd hadn't fled. They'd circled around, and now they charged through Cassidy's camp like a flood. Horses everywhere, kicking, biting, scattering men and supplies. In the chaos, Samuel wheeled back to Eleanor and White Dove, lowering himself for them to mount. They rode hard toward Fort Benton, the town's buildings visible in the distance. But Cassidy, thrown from his horse, stood and aimed his rifle. The shot cracked through the morning air. Samuel screamed but didn't stop running. Eleanor felt hot blood soaking her leg where it pressed against his shoulder. He'd been hit, badly, but still, he ran. The wild herd stayed behind, keeping Cassidy's men busy, but Cassidy himself pursued on foot, reloading as he came. Samuel's stride was breaking, stumbling. More blood. So much blood. They were still a mile from town when his legs finally gave out. He went down hard but controlled, making sure Eleanor and White Dove rolled clear rather than being crushed. Go, Eleanor told White Dove. Run to town. Find the judge's house. Tell them everything. The girl hesitated, but Eleanor pushed her. Now. Samuel's sacrifice means nothing if you don't get help. White Dove ran, her injured leg barely slowing her. Eleanor knelt beside Samuel, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder. The bullet had gone deep, too deep. His breathing was labored, eyes rolling with pain, but he kept trying to stand, to put himself between her and where Cassidy would appear. Stop, brave one. Rest, she whispered, using every cavalry command James had taught her for calming horses. Samuel settled slightly, but kept watching the horizon. She could see Cassidy approaching now, taking his time, certain of victory. Touching scene, Cassidy called out, still 100 yards away. The widow and her dead husband's horse. You know, James begged at the end. When the poison really took hold, he begged for water, for mercy. I gave him neither. Samuel's eyes found Eleanor's, and she saw something there beyond animal understanding. Decision, purpose. With enormous effort, he rolled to his feet, blood streaming down his chest. He positioned himself in front of her one last time, legs shaking but standing. That horse can barely stand. Cassidy laughed, raising his rifle. One shot and you're mine. But Samuel wasn't done. As Cassidy aimed, the horse screamed, not in pain but in defiance, a sound that echoed across the prairie. It was answered. The thunder returned. The wild herd, Samuel's army, created one more charge, one more moment of chaos, and in the distance, from Fort Benton, came other sounds. Horses, many horses. White Dove had reached help. Ruth's face went white when she saw Eleanor covered in blood, kneeling beside the collapsed horse. My God, Eleanor, we thought you were dead. The creditors said you'd wandered off into the wilderness. But her shock turned to steel when she saw Cassidy approaching with his rifle raised. "Federal marshals are coming," Ruth shouted at Cassidy. "White Dove told us everything." "You're done." Her husband, Judge Patterson, emerged from the arriving group, accompanied by 6 armed marshals and something unexpected. 15 Blackfoot warriors, painted for war, led by an elderly chief who went straight to Samuel. The chief knelt beside the dying horse, speaking in Blackfoot. White Dove translated through tears. He says, "Spirit who remembers was born to his sister's mare 20 winters ago, the horse that connects our worlds, the bridge between peoples." The chief's weathered hands found the wound, and his face grew dark. "This is murder of a sacred being." Cassidy tried to run, but the wild herd, still circling, blocked every escape. He stood trapped between federal law and Blackfoot justice. "It's just a horse," he sputtered. "You can't try me for shooting a horse." Judge Patterson dismounted, carrying documents White Dove had given him. "No, but I can try you for the murder of James Whitmore, the murders of White Dove's parents, and the attempted murders of Eleanor Whitmore and this child." He looked at the blood-soaked ground. "And that horse is evidence. He's the only witness to all your crimes." Ruth had brought the town doctor, but it was the Blackfoot healer who pushed past him to reach Samuel. The old woman examined the wound with gentle expertise. "Bullet missed the heart, but tore vessels. He holds his blood inside by will alone. He waits for something." Eleanor knew what. She pressed her face to Samuel's neck. "It's okay. You did it. You saved us. You can rest now." But Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on Cassidy, watching, waiting. The judge opened an official investigation right there on the bloodied ground. Eleanor presented James's journal. White Dove testified about her parents' murder. The Blackfoot chief produced documents showing Cassidy had poisoned wells on reservation land. Even some of Cassidy's own men, surrounded and outnumbered, began confessing to avoid the noose. "James suspected you," Eleanor said, standing despite her shaking legs. "He wrote it all down. The tea you brought, how sick he got right after, how you pressed him about land documents while he was dying." She pulled out the journal's final entry. He wrote, "Cassidy is poisoning me. If I die, it's murder." Cassidy pulled a hidden derringer, aiming at Eleanor. The shot rang out, but it wasn't his. Ruth stood with a smoking rifle, having shot the gun from his hand. "You took my sister's husband. You won't take my sister." As the marshals chained Cassidy, Samuel finally relaxed. His great head lowered to the ground, breathing shallow but steady. The Blackfoot healer worked through the day, packing the wound with medicines Eleanor didn't recognize, chanting in languages older than memory. "He chooses now," she finally said, "to stay or go to the spirit world. We can only wait." The judge set up court in Fort Benton's courthouse. The trial would be federal, beyond the reach of local corruption. Cassidy would face justice for multiple murders. But Eleanor couldn't celebrate. She stayed with Samuel as they carefully moved him to Ruth's stable, the finest in town. White Dove never left his side, singing Blackfoot songs her mother had taught her, songs about horses that chose to become human guardians. For 3 days, Samuel lingered between worlds. The bullet had been removed, the wound cleaned and stitched, but infection had set in. The horse that had survived everything, saved everyone, was dying from protecting them one last time. The fever broke on the 4th day. Samuel's eyes opened clear and focused, finding Eleanor first, then White Dove, then looking for something else, checking. Cassidy was gone, imprisoned awaiting trial for murder. The threat was over. Only then did the great horse truly rest, letting his body heal instead of just surviving. Judge Patterson's ruling came down like thunder. Cassidy would hang for the murders of James Whitmore and White Dove's parents. The stolen water rights were returned to their rightful owners. But more importantly, White Dove's testimony had revealed something larger. 23 mysterious deaths over 5 years, all involving land disputes, all with Cassidy nearby. Federal investigators descended on the territory like locusts, unraveling an empire built on poison and bullets. Eleanor officially adopted White Dove in a ceremony that brought together the town courthouse and the Blackfoot Tribal Council. Ruth cried when White Dove called her Aunt Ruth for the first time. The girl who'd lost everything had gained a family that spanned two worlds, connected by a horse that refused to let death win. They established the ranch on White Dove's family land, using the water rights that had cost so much blood. Eleanor thought Samuel would return to the wild once healed, but he never left. Instead, something more remarkable happened. Every spring, he'd disappear for 3 days, returning with the wild herd. Mares would stay to foal, their babies growing up knowing both wilderness and human kindness. The ranch became famous for horses that seemed to understand human hearts. White Dove grew strong and brilliant, studying veterinary medicine through books Ruth sent from the East. The Blackfoot elders taught her their horse medicine while Eleanor shared her medical knowledge. By 16, she could set a bone, birth a foal, and diagnose illnesses in both horses and humans. The territory's first native female veterinarian, the newspapers would later say, though she was so much more. Samuel aged gracefully, his scarred shoulder never quite right, but never slowing him down. He taught the young horses, showed them the secret paths through the mountains, the hidden valleys, the safe places. Every horse on the ranch learned his lessons, carrying forward his knowledge like a living library. The ranch grew into a sanctuary. Broken horses arrived and left whole. Orphaned children, both white and native, found home there. Eleanor used her midwife skills to help women from both communities, while White Dove became the bridge between worlds her parents had dreamed of. And through it all, Samuel stood guard, the horse that remembered everything. 23 years after that day in the forest, Samuel lay in the pasture he loved best, surrounded by his herd. His daughters and sons, granddaughters and grandsons, over 100 horses that carried his blood and wisdom. Eleanor sat beside him, her hair gray now, White Dove's children playing nearby. White Dove herself, now Dr. White Dove Whitmore, held his great head in her lap. "You gave us everything," Eleanor whispered to him. "You gave us family, purpose, home. You refused to let us die alone, and because of that, none of us ever were." Samuel's eyes found each face one last time. The widow he'd saved, the child he'd protected, the grandchildren he'd watched grow, the herd he'd led. Then, with the sunset painting the Montana sky purple and gold, the horse who remembered everything took his last breath, surrounded by 3 generations of the family he'd created by simply refusing to leave. They buried him on the highest hill, where he could watch over the valley forever. And every spring, when the wild herds run through the ranch, they stop at his grave, pawing the earth, remembering the horse who chose love over wilderness, who built a family from ashes and tears. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to ensure you never miss another tale of hope, redemption, and the powerful bonds between humans and animals. Tomorrow's story will take you on another extraordinary adventure you won't want to miss.